Had a wee bit of a hiccup. We're down to 720p because I did not renew my thingamajigger. I was employed with the state, and then that ended because I was a subcontractor and I had no department to go back to. So I'm going to get into this and start talking about friendships and culture. And culture. Yeah, we're going to talk about culture. Good morning and welcome to Psych Talk, where we talk psychology and then some. I am your host, Sean Hupel. And if you haven't been catching it, you can always catch this later on if, let's say, you need to turn your car off and go to work. Perfectly understandable. This is an hour-long show, and you can always catch me at Autistic Commando on YouTube. This will be transcribed with video on there, and maybe some behind the scenes here and there. So what are we talking about today? Today we're going to talk about generational gaps. So just to give you a little insight to me, I am the tail end of millennial. I am born in 1986 on September 30th. Okay? And in some definitions, I'm technically a millennial. When I found that out, I actually felt offended. Because my generation, we are, how to put this? The generation before us was the product of free-range parenting. And when I say free-range parenting, what I'm referring to is some of them blew off their hands and some of them didn't make it. Now, my generation, we were the ones that, okay, we were like supervised free-range parenting. Okay, the last generation went through it, they survived, and they kind of weeded out the wheat from the chaff, you know? But I'm also that kid that, true story, and this is a true story. I went to Salem Academy back when Mr. Pepley, his name was Pepley, but Principal Pepley is what a lot of us called him. And fifth grade, my grandmother's birthday is on July 4th. Or, yeah, still is. And, yeah, I got creative as an autistic person and decided, you know what, I'm going to make her a firework because I was broke. And I was also fat and lazy. No, not fat at the time, but definitely lazy. So, yeah, I didn't want to go out and earn money and do chores and not play video games. So, I decided to do the internet thing and make her some fireworks. And what did I find? Lo and behold, the Anarchist Cookbook. Not joking here. So I printed off about 3 pages worth, and I was going to convert some of those things on there and study into them because I didn't know what sulfur was and phosphate. I didn't know what those things were, so I wanted to go to school and look it up during my lunch break. And I wanted to study those designs. Yes. Anyway, long story short was people freaked out, way overreacted, and of course, rich parents, they're all like, oh my gosh, I'm so privileged, and my child, oh my god. And this was within a year of Thurston High. So this was back in the day, back with the first school shooting that made major news, at least in my generation. So basically what Thurston High did was it shattered a perception. See, I was actually going to this, but still, it was an interesting story. And later on, that 4th of July, I tried to make her a firework. I modified a few things that we bought, at the, fireworks store. And I decided, you know what? Since I'm kind of semi on restriction, I'm going to play with these Tic Tac, or with these Poppets. And I had a Tic Tac box. And I got it filled, and I squeezed it a little bit too hard, put a few holes in my chest. But I survived. Free range parenting. Boom, nailed it. But the long story short of that is the old generation basically didn't have too much supervision because the parents were working. And then the generation that I come from, we were raised by those folks, the ones that, sorted the wheat from the chaff, 1970s and 60s and all that good stuff. They were in high school. And that was a unique time. But then you got my generation. And we knew what it was like to scrape your knee. I fell, scraped my knee. My mother yelled at me to get back inside because I just wanted to keep playing. She put a Band-Aid on me and sent me right back out playing. I mean, that's the generation I come from. And were we entitled? Yes. But I was following TikTok, which I have the same handle on TikTok. It's Autistic Commando. And there was a person saying, or asking a question, are millennials happy? And I guess the truth of it is not really, not as a culture. Of course, my generation, we're in our 30s and going on our 40s, and, well, in our 40s. And of course, there's maturity that comes from that, and it's a funny thing to go through situations and have your parents be right. You know, those people you didn't want to listen to? Yeah, it was a funny thing. But we've all been through it. The same way they went through it, and the same way their parents went through it, and their parents before them, and their parents before them. The difference is we may celebrate political tradition and cultural tradition, but we don't necessarily celebrate our elders. In fact, we've had to install laws to protect them because the generation that followed got selfish and entitled. So why did this happen? Because pretty much what everybody's been saying, this is going to hit home. What people have been saying for the past few generations is, yeah, things are eroding. Things are eroding. No, I need an adult. Well, I am the adult. It's eroding. Stop it. So they're yelling at us and saying that our culture and moral fabric is going to the wayside, and we're just like, oh, whatever. Same way that the children of the next generation are doing to us. So pretty much we're not learning from the previous generations, and sure enough, our moral fabric eroded. In fact, I can systemically trace it. But then again, I am obsessive about psychology. Truly obsessive. Like, grossly obsessive. But when they said that it was going to, like, that what's on TV, like The Simpsons and all that, would erode moral fabric, yeah, it desensitized us as a generation. See, I am thankful that I was raised by shows like Reading Rainbow with LeVar Burton. I mean, I loved him in Star Trek, and I love his heart today because he's still trying to revive Reading Rainbow. And he's got another show that he just launched under the same format. Like, he wanted to continue teaching the next generation because he saw the value and heard the value firsthand from people like me that said, wow, you were so impactful. And another person, which everybody knows Mr. Rogers. Everybody. He got a movie about him, right? But the reason being was he was very compassionate. He had a heart for people the same way that pretty much every religion teaches since the beginning of time. Every culture teaches as idealistic since the beginning of time. Unless, Genghis Khan and all that good stuff, they were warlike. Tribal and warlike. But we're not like that. In fact, one thing that I'm noting is our complacency as a culture. One thing that I never thought I would say in my lifetime, when there's a lot of things, is China may have a stronger navy than we do. And they were already like fighting us pretty hard back when they had MiGs, and they've got better equipment now. They've been shoring up. And that's kind of a scary thought in a way, because dictatorships, the reason that they don't really succeed for the people, the reason that China and Russia have been stealing our technology for decades and have been playing catch up with us is the strength of our diversity. You see, when you have a narrow thought process in an autocratic environment, yeah, eventually it's going to, taper off to where, you can gain favor and you can gain placement and status. But it's not going to be too terribly different from life in America, except that, don't complain too loud, otherwise they'll fix it for you. Now, one thing I'll say is, like Russia, they've been stealing from us for a while. China, same thing. And they can say, People's Republic of China. It's not a republic. It's not. Xi Jinping is basically an autocratic dictator. Same thing with Vladimir Putin. It's why pretty much everybody on his, the equivalent to Congress, walked out when he basically introduced a new rule saying, I can be here forever. But one thing I will say about those two, because I covered the alpha-beta complex in a previous episode, which again, I disclaimed on there that whether it's natural or naturalized, we still adopt the alpha-beta complex massively, especially in the United States of America. But then again, we're a narcissistic country that is complacent. And Xi Jinping I don't I haven't seen any evidence of him not being an alpha, but when it comes to Vladimir Putin, beta all day long. Again, Autistic Commando on YouTube. You can check it out. The previous episode, I covered the alpha beta complex. But, I mean, Vladimir Putin, if you have to take off your shirt and sit on top of a horse to feel better about yourself publicly, you are not an alpha. Now, he is a naturalized alpha, meaning he's basically become a pseudo-alpha because of his environment and because of his background. Okay, but he's very much a beta when it comes to his possessiveness and overall insecurity, because insecure people, they want to be secure at all times. What better way to be secure than to gain an autocratic status as a dictator and then lie about it? Because, put it this way, betas have no problem lying if it betters themselves. I've never seen the contrary. But again, natural versus naturalized. Yes, I know the alpha beta complex was no, turn it down. But at the same time, we are a narcissistic country. We are very narcissistic. We value material possessions, we value status, we value money. And it's only grown so since my generation, when people could sing a hit single and have enough money to basically retire early. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Maya Harrison was relative to that. She had like 1 or 2 albums, and she's just, out there living life. Like, she does a few shows here and there, I guess, like reunions for people of my age. But the end-all be-all is she lives a very vegan lifestyle. I mean, I follow her because I liked her music and I liked her dancing and all that good stuff. I was a huge MTV fan. Even Limp Bizkit. I mean, I still remember, well, I'm not going to repeat the video because I don't want to do that on open air. But at the same time, he had a couple ones that I'm just like, dude, those dancers are horrible. Like, what's going on with you? Get a hold of your life. But I remember all of them. I was even at a Fozzy concert where Dog Bone Sanctuary opened up. And I actually really liked that band. But I was also, I was the sore thumb sticking out because I had no idea about rock. I was just there with a friend. And it was like my second concert, period. But I say all that to say that we've all been to a concert, right? And we've all been to video arcades. We've all been on vacation. There are places in the world where people don't have that. And we take it for granted. Meaning, literally, we have it built into our employment to where we can take vacation days. So what's that got to do with the price of tea in China? We are a very narcissistic country, and we are very sociopathic. If we weren't so narcissistic, well, let me back up a little bit. So the previous generation had a lot more options than my generation. Because again, on TikTok, my handle on TikTok is Autistic Commando, same as YouTube. And there was a young lady from, I think, Gen Y, because why? She was asking, so do Gen Xers and Millennials, are they happy? The long story short is, we're really not. I mean, if we really take a good gander at it, the American dream is gone for a lot of people. The middle class is gone for a lot of people. And we just had basically an employment renaissance where COVID forced people out of employment. And then they're like, you know what? I'm going to do my own thing. And so now these same employers that were barely scraping minimum wage are now offering benefits and $16 an hour and so on and so forth. They could have already done that. These major companies, and companies plural, like almost the entire restaurant industry, they could have paid better all the time because now they can afford to do so, right? But it was narcissism that basically made it to where people were protesting, and basically we had this out called COVID, which I hate to call it that, like an out, but at the same time, for some people it was. It empowered them to seek out education, to seek out a couple dreams, because they're on unemployment. They don't have work or anything like that. They got to occupy their time somehow. So what they do is they decided to take their life into their own hands. That's something that you won't really see in a communist society. In fact, I had a significant other that was in Thailand. And that significant other, when COVID hit, she had, we met when she was going to college over at Wazoo. And she ended up flying back for good reason. Um, I wanted to get myself more stable, and then that just drug on for a bit. And then COVID hit, literally as I was looking into plane tickets and getting my passport renewed. And COVID hits, and she's got asthma and all of that and allergies. And she was really deathly afraid because over there, they were so locked down that nobody could go to the hospital. Seriously, nobody could go to the hospital. They weren't allowed to leave their homes. That is what an autocratic government does. Meaning, let's say you didn't stock up, you didn't shore up, and you didn't, keep some food in your house. You're in your house. We take our society right now for granted, grossly so. Because all of us have TVs, whereas in other countries they don't even have running water. We take so many privileges for granted, and now China likely has a stronger navy than we do. Somebody who's been stealing our technology for decades. And here we are complacent. We're so busy as a country fighting amongst ourselves over political ideology. All the while, other countries are getting stronger. They're unifying. And unifying is what made us strong. So, again, price of tea in China. What does it have to do with it? The way that my generation grew up, we were handed all of the things that the baby boomers wish they had. Basically, they were living out their dreams through us because they really worked hard. That's one thing I've never seen, is I've never seen my father as a child work less than 12 hours a day. I've never seen that. But then again, he also built something from scratch. I watched him do it. In fact, he was a very RH Factor Insurance on the corner of State and Lancaster in Salem, Oregon, by the way. That was a respected company. It was a respected insurance agency, and for good reason. My father, crossed his T's and dotted his I's, and he worked very, very hard. I watched that, and I learned from that. That's about what I learned from him. Because remember how there was this huge, huge deal back in our generation, if you're a millennial or around there, about have the talk with your kids. Why? Because babies. And people were having babies left and right. In fact, so many people I went to high school with, they had kids. Like, plural in some cases. And it was just kind of impressive because we were in the upper lower class, if not lower middle class, economically. We had a good space of land. My parents, they were always, improving the land and everything like that. We built a quarter-acre creek by hand, every single rock and all the mortar, when I was like 15 or something like that. There was so much improvement in house improvement they did. Whereas my generation, we don't really think about house improvement. We always think about money. How much does it cost? Can we get any money from it? Can we use this house to put a down payment on another house? Second mortgage and all that good stuff. Like, we look into ways to leverage our assets. We don't look at them as our safe havens, per se. I mean, in some cases they do. Like my best friend, he is living the American dream. He worked his way up from the absolute bottom, and he is living extremely comfortable in a 2-story beautiful house in just this suburbia. It's wonderful. And he's got his beautiful sports truck. It's everything he drives is Dodge. And he's got a wonderful family. Very spoiled, very entitled, glued to their electronic devices. And I contributed to that because I gave them a PlayStation 2 and a PlayStation 4. But that's because those were nostalgic to me. Those were things I grew up with. well, not the PlayStation 4, but the PlayStation 2. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that was high school. Junior high and high school. Dreamcast. I'm still a Dreamcast aficionado. But I grew up with video games. I grew up with Mr. Rogers, Reading Rainbow. I grew up with Simpsons. And I grew up with MTV. Music Television is what it stood for. In fact, very few people of the new generation could even recall the three letters slash numbers VH1. Remember that? Like when you couldn't see the music video you wanted to, you flip from MTV to VH1. It's like, oh, okay, what's up? And VH1 would, look into the artists and all that good stuff. It was more for older folks than what I was at the time. But overall, we have seen a deterioration. Like we see more swear words. We've seen more swear words in television, like broadcast television. Things that you would never hear in the 90s are commonplace now. And I mean, those are things you would only hear in an R-rated movie. Bare minimum PG-13. Bare minimum. But now, it's just commonplace. You have talk show hosts doing that. You have The Simpsons saying certain words. South Park. Well, they kind of pioneered a few of those. But they're also really... Matt Stone and Trey Parker are really big on challenging stereotypes. They're really, really big. And they're really big on pointing out public flaws. And what we're seeing right now is there are a lot of commentators and a lot of animators and a lot of people creating television shows that will point out societal flaws, meaning racism and all of that. South Park pointed that out by labeling the only African-American person, well, black person. Because I've talked to a lot of black folks. They're like, no, don't call me African American. I'm American, and I'm totally with that, 100%. So the only black person on there was named Token, and so many people didn't catch that for years as to the significance of it because the only one, the token black person, named Token, and they were pointing out that flaw in society, the same way that like they made it fun to know disabled people. In fact, one of my friends, Warren, he's old enough to be probably my parent, and he loves the episode about the Crips from South Park. And yeah, I know I'm talking South Park. Don't let me lose you, all right? Stay with me. Because believe it or not, that show is really intelligent, but in a kind of crass way. But the Crips, I mean, you had a couple different known, like, people with disabilities. One had to walk with, one was on a wheelchair, like one of those motor wheelchairs. That was Timmy. And then I think it was Jimmy, that his legs didn't work. And it was just a hilarious episode of just awkwardness and misunderstanding. But in reality, too, is shows like that helped people realize that, okay, yeah, they might be different, but we should accept them. Like, that's how I grew up. First grade, it was a privilege to sit with the disabled children, the people with learning disabilities and whatnot. It was a privilege to have lunch with them. And you had to be good to be able to do so. And then we go play with them at recess and whatnot, but nowadays you see the level of acceptance from people that have a good heart, but then you see so many people that are narcissistic. Now, narcissism is where you're material. You value societal status, money, things. Okay, that's why whenever somebody says, oh, I only drive Porsche, that was a neighbor of mine. Yeah, I only drive Porsche because I had a 1944 Porsche 944. And I was going to restore it. And then I decided, you know what? Too much work. But he saw that vehicle in my 76 MG Midget, and he's just like, yeah, but I only drive Porsche. And the way that I see Porsche is it's played. Everybody knows Porsche. Porsche is like the poor man's wealthy car. Or the wealthy man's poor car. There we go. Wealthy man's poor car. Poor man's wealthy car was a Lincoln. But the wealthy man's poor car is a Porsche because it's the low end of the high end. But it's so played and it's so expensive to maintain and so on and so forth. And whenever I see those, I'm just like, okay, yeah, you don't really know who you are, because a Porsche is probably one of the most generic wealthy person cars, period. In fact, you don't even have to be wealthy. I owned one. And it was a classic that's still appreciating. I should have kept it. But we value so much about material things. Remember when, in fact, my parents could remember when cell phones were such a big deal, like you had to be super wealthy to have a cell phone. And technology is like that, where the super privileged or the super wealthy, I'll say that. Well, privileged, yeah, it's America. And pretty much we're all privileged, but some people more so than others. And what happens is, when you have so much privilege, you have less drive to innovate. In China, they have drive to innovate, plus they have a dictator. Same thing with Russia. They have drive to innovate, plus they have, and those dictators can basically pass along, hey, you do this or else. And they mean it. But then we've got this society that we're in, this massive experiment, and it's working. It's been working. Well, what we've done is we've become so complacent, and we've allowed so many things to change our perspective. Right now, politically, people don't really want to say out loud if they lean left or right, because it's so polarized. And what's happened is, through our lack of innovation and our lack of education overall, because I am very disappointed in the education generation over generation, before mine, to mine, and after mine. And when you drop education, you lower the ability of people to think for themselves without having to rely on somebody else to think for them. It makes people lazy. But then, let's look at the next generation. I'm going to tie this together, because I always do, right? The next generation, my nieces and nephews, I play Fortnite with them. But what people celebrate now is poor sportsmanship. So Fortnite is a game where a whole bunch of cartoony characters are going out and trying to basically kill each other with guns. And don't get me wrong, I played Counter-Strike as a kid. I really do like first-person shooter games. I think they're fun, and a whole generation of kids think so too. And what came of that is, yeah, it's a very innovative video game. Like, you can actually build up walls and ramps and all that good stuff to get better vantage points and, tackle on opponents. And people stream it too. Like, Ninja made streaming video games a pretty big deal, right next to this guy named PewDiePie. But if you look up Ninja Fortnite on YouTube, you can see what I'm talking about. And these kids are watching this adult throw fits. And they're celebrating it and laughing at it, and this is somebody that they admire. This adult who is skinny, who throws fits at video games and has colored hair. Blue hair was his big one. And then when they play video games, the term that goes around right now is toxic. So, for example, I know a few players that, well, poor sportsmanship. You kill somebody, you can dance on top of them. Like, dance on top of them. Like, you can buy dances that you can use to dance on top of them. Not joking. I actually have a few. And I've done it once or twice. Just because, after it's happened so many times, if you can't beat them. And I just did tonight with my best friend. And they've got a whole culture around that game too, because tonight with my best friend, we got a dub. Dub stands for W. W stands for win. But that's a shortcut. Saying dub instead of I gotta win. Okay, it's not that much different, except now you've got this culture where people glorify, these kids are glorifying toxic behavior, such as poor sportsmanship, gloating over a fallen player, throwing fits when you lose. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking about how I came up. And how my grams I've told you in previous episodes that Grams was about to be a literal nun. And she raised me with these old school ideals. Like, I still engage in chivalry, I still believe in the old ways. Because they're right. But this new generation isn't even getting exposure to that. Because my generation didn't get exposure to that. Maybe a little bit here and there. Basic manners, chew with your mouth closed. Which is, can you believe that's actually a challenge now? Again. But just basic manners, holding doors and letting people in traffic and all that good stuff. Like, that's how I was raised. Because Grams had a lot to do with it. I mean, she sewed quilt tops for the homeless, but not everybody had that rearing. And then you got this new generation that literally, like during the pandemic, kids were playing Fortnite in mass numbers. Mass numbers. And now Fortnite is part of the online esports community. Like, if you play Fortnite at a professional level, you're considered an athlete. They call you an athlete. I've been to these tournaments. I've even competed in a couple. Not for Fortnite, but for Street Fighter and a couple others. And they call their main players that are sponsored athletes. My generation knows what's wrong with that term being used in that way. If you're an athlete, that means you have a sense of stamina and accomplishment that goes beyond the mental. There's physical prowess to being an athlete. Now, there are other terms that can be used, but athlete was the most convenient because cutting short corners. A dub. I got a dub tonight with my best friend, throwing a grenade literally halfway across the map. I feel very proud of that as a gamer. But at the same time, I also lamented the fact that I wasn't able to dance because my game glitched. A victory dance, right? That's the spin. That's how people are seeing toxic behavior, poor sportsmanship. You aren't supposed to gloat when you win. Or at least that's not how it used to be. But it is now. And with all these different diminishments, I mean, let's go to another one. One that affected my generation, right? Because we're going to get to the whole thing that I mentioned before about my generation being happy, millennials, and not being happy. But back in the 1980s, there's a rumor that still goes around where a whole bunch of R&B, hip-hop, rap artists were approached by, producers to basically create a culture, a thuggish culture, right? And there was a spin to it. There was an agenda. And if that was a goal, then mission accomplished. Because thug was glorified. Just like being toxic in Fortnite, being a thug in the 90s and 2000s, and, well, not until the 2010s, but like 90s and 2000s. Yeah, being a thug was kind of glorified. But at the same time, it was also used to address a certain group of people in the news. And I guess a part of me is wondering, like, wow, this erosion and miseducation going on right now. I see moral fabric diminishing because you've got basically babies raising babies. My generation, I would not, if I had to choose how to say this, if I had to rely on a random person of my age to drop off a letter on a specific day a couple weeks out, otherwise I would die, then I would be getting my affairs in order. True story. Because that's how little I have faith in my generation right now. Then I see this upcoming generation where they have less education, and we're squabbling over whether or not to teach black history. Forget all the other ethnicities that we can teach about. We don't want to teach about black history, and we're labeling it as critical race theory. If you want to diminish something and if you want to make something look bad, give it a name. It's called turning it into the colloquial, and that's the last episode I just did. It's the basis for racism, bias, and all that. but not just like racism, like any sort of discrimination. It all boils down to the colloquial. You can give something a stereotype, a term, a definition. And when you do that, it becomes a lot easier to objectify that, which is what happened in Nazi Germany by calling the Jewish people, what were they called, rats and vermin, and in Rwanda, where they were called cockroaches, something to be detested that we can now give a different definition to because it's a word. Millennial is a word. It's a word become stereotype, privileged, entitled, occasionally hardworking, so on and so forth. I mean, we've been around for so long that we have some pretty accurate stereotypes to our macro environment, meaning just our generation as a whole. But with this diminishment of culture and character, what we're seeing other folks more than willing to take money from somebody else and smile about it. Like, that's something that back in the day wouldn't be agreed to, right? This next generation is basically glorifying conquest in a game called Fortnite. Along with, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I like Fortnite. How you raise your parents is how they're going to, or I'm sorry, how parents raise their children is how the children are going to turn out, usually. Not always, but usually. But we don't see so much free-range parenting anymore because all these kids are online and they're getting all sorts of stimuli. And those all sorts of stimuli, well, what it does is it hyper-engages them. But my generation was hyper-engaged too. A lot of us were raised by the television. We weren't raised by our parents. Our parents were working. Both of them usually. And if not, the mother was a homemaker, very traditional American setting. Because when I say traditional American, we all know white picket fence, the lightly two-story house, and so on and so forth. Or the one-story house with maybe a second division up top. Or an attic. The nice lawn, the husband coming home from work, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's very much 1950s-esque. My generation was, as far as how we saw our parents engage and how we saw our parents act. But then our parents were working, so we were raised by MTV, VH1, Simpsons, Family Guy. I really love Stewie. Stewie is awesome. But at the same time, glorifying Stewie is also glorifying intellect, whereas glorifying I'm not going to go into Married with Children. But let's go back to MTV, since we're on TV shows and such. One thing MTV taught us is that if you can get a hit single like Maya Harrison, you can make it big and then you can retire. That's not the case anymore. You become a personality. Cardi B is a perfect example of that. Okay. Nicki Minaj, she's an actress. If you look at her, she was aspiring to be an actress, not a rapper. But she took her in, and she took her out. Because that's what we call it, an out. We glorify narcissism because we want to be that person. Okay? Think of it as the inverse to Schadenfreude. So, we basically idolize that person because we want to be that person. In fact, in the case of Donald J. Trump, former president, that was the case with a lot of his followers. They wanted to get away with what he could do and get away with, and still has for the most part. In fact, that perfectly segues into what I want to go into. Is we're entitled, which means we feel privileged. We feel like we can do stuff. Only we can't. We have laws. And we have financial limitations, social limitations, so on and so forth. We have limitations. More so than ever before because people are more narcissistic, meaning they're willing to walk over somebody else to get what they want. And so we've got this generation where, colleges are defrauding students. I am somewhat a victim. I don't want to call myself, I do. But it's not that I want to, it's that it's appropriate. I don't want to. But that's also contrary to narcissism. People with narcissistic tendencies, they want to get their way all the time, and they'll use multiple tactics to do so, to accumulate societal status and wealth. That's the prerogative of any beta, which I haven't met an alpha that was a narcissist. Never. I've never met an alpha that was a sociopath. Never. Think about that for a second. I've never met an alpha that was a narcissist or sociopath, because both of those are indicative to the beta side of the alpha-beta complex, assuming you want to believe that or look at the naturalized, meaning our society adopts the alpha-beta complex in movies, in just conversation. Like if you're called a beta, we know that that's a bad thing. Man, Jane Elliott's coming in my mind right now. But we're not going to go into that. That was another episode. But we know that being a beta is bad and being an alpha is yay. We know that. That is known in our society, but it also plays into narcissism. Why? Because alphas, they just have a natural swagger to them. But betas, they got something else. They are willing to lower their moral guidelines in order to achieve what they want. And what do most people want? They want the house, they want the nice car, they want the good life, they want the easy life. Problem is, as a country, we've been living the easy life for so long that China's getting ahead of us. Japan is by far technologically ahead of us. And we are their military ever since World War II. And then you've got European countries like Russia. They're trying to compete with us, and they may actually pull it off. They're getting closer and closer, but then again, they also play some shady tactics, which is why I call Putin a beta, because he has no moral scruples whatsoever. And so we became complacent and fat and happy in America, and we're not innovating like we used to. In fact, we're at each other's throats, and even teaching our children to celebrate victory. And by celebrating victory, that means showing poor sportsmanship in what's known as being toxic. And it's celebrated by kids. So, Donald J. Trump, right? Let's go to January 6th. Why did it happen? Let's look at it from a fundamental standpoint. Right now, I can't achieve what I want to achieve. As I mentioned, the college I went to, basically, they spent all of my financial aid, all of that. Like, they maxed out my student loans. And then they tried to push me into, they threw me a document that's, it's a long story, and it's part of why I learned to speak legalese and why I went into studying law privately. And I'm quite accomplished, at least for somebody that's not a lawyer. I mean, 12 lawsuits, and the only one that I lost, which all of those I filed somewhere else, like to somebody else. The only one that I lost was when I actually trusted a lawyer and hired one. But my generation doesn't study like that anymore, not unless we have to. And the next generation doesn't really study at all. They go by commentators. In fact, my generation's starting to go by commentators now too, because we're so occupied trying to reach the imaginary middle class that's become imaginary in my lifetime. We're trying to reach that, and we're trying to better ourselves as 30 and 40-year-olds and so on. But ultimately, we're dancing in circles because we're directionless, and there are glass ceilings that are in place from narcissistic policies and narcissistic laws that better a certain group or better an individual, but disenfranchise the whole. I mean, voting restriction laws. I mean, I never thought I would hear such a renewal of voter restriction laws. I never thought I would hear that. Not in my lifetime. And yet here we are, multiple states, like more than 10 states, are enacting those laws in order to advance their political advantage, or to regain a political advantage to the point of disenfranchising Americans. I mean, in my opinion, it's traitorous, but at the same time, it's definitely un-American. And then we have January 6th. If you look at those people, a lot of them are from my generation. But there's also glass ceilings, there's barriers, there's people have felt limited because we feel entitled. We feel entitled to trying to accomplish the American dream. But the problem is we can't always accomplish the American dream. So what do? We start seeking out whatever advantage we can, whatever support we can, whatever groups we can. We become tribal. And in becoming tribal, what ends up happening is it becomes us and them. While these other countries are united under dictators, I mean, that's what they are, we are divided, more so than any other time in living memory. There are people that are over 100 years old. They have never seen this country this divided. Not even during Vietnam. And that was a big, big time. Let me tell you something. So we got this glass ceiling, and we've got this polarizing language, and people that either aren't as educated as they should be. Because believe me, anybody today could not, like anybody of my generation, could not pass the standard test that people had to pass in my grandmother's generation, like math or writing or any of that. We couldn't do it. The same grade level and all that, they would be superseding us, and they were forced to do it. Free range parenting, and they had education. Our education system's diminished to the point where we don't even want to teach Black history, Black American history. It's American history. It shouldn't even be an ethnicity, but we've polarized that too. Well, we've further polarized it. It's always been polarized. I didn't even know that Oregon was, at one point, and still kind of is, the most racist state in the country. I didn't know that. I didn't know you couldn't even own land out here if you were Black. Yeah, they just completely forced Black folks out for a long time. And there are still people maintaining those ideologies. I mean, education's been lacking and our moral fabric has been under attack for a long time. But then these other TV shows basically give permission. The same way that Trump basically gave a lot of his base permission to act out. So why were they acting out? Glass ceiling. They don't have a direction. A lot of people don't. My generation, we were supervised free-range parenting. And there are so many challenges. Like we have so many barriers to forming relationships. So many barriers. And a lot of these are self-imposed. At the same time, we're so cliquish and we're so privileged. When I heard that everybody could get a trophy just for participating, myself and so many other people said, wow, America is really going down. And it was accurate. We have. Right now, instead of recognizing the external threats to our country that have been active, we are questioning whether or not those active threats even happened. And we're questioning the professionals that dedicate their lives to, for example, healthcare, Dr. Fauci. We're questioning him. Now, the vaccines, sure. I would not take the J&J vaccine, but I did take 2 doses of Pfizer. In fact, I took my second one today. And I encourage all of you to do so because the Delta variant is worse. It spreads quicker. It's a pervasive variant, and it's exactly what Dr. Fauci and other experts who spend their entire lives working in their field say, oh, this is a threat. This is bad, right? And then we have the military complex like the CIA, NSA, FBI, so on and so forth, Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, all of them saying the same thing, and we're questioning it. Seriously. They're all saying the same thing. Like, for example, Russia attacked us. There's no doubt about that. I know people that work in the IT sector of elections and so on and so forth. There is no doubt that they attacked us, that they tried to influence us and infiltrate, that they created bots to create fake websites to get people polarized even further. Because a country divided isn't a country that's strong. And a country that doesn't have the education to learn from the past, that's a country that's not going to move into the future with an educated standpoint. And here we are, polarized, and our moral fabric has been diminished. And we should be coming together like we used to. That's what made us strong. We should all be getting vaccinated. And we should be able to trust the professionals, yet we question them. And so, here we are. We have January 6th, where people who feel disenfranchised, where people who feel lesser valued, they are basically finding something that will make them excited. In fact, I'll tell you about some wealthy people I know. Some wealthy people I know are super nice. Super crazy nice. And, like, nice to the point of, like, wow, are you a serial killer? Like, they are nice. And then some are just mean. In fact, the wealthier you get, especially when it comes to the kids, because some of the kids were my clients. Like, the father made the money, or, yeah, it's usually the father. I don't want to limit it to, like, hey, did the mother not make the money? Like, that's just, their case. But they were super privileged. But what happens when you don't have anywhere to go, like anything to struggle for? Well, when you're super privileged and you're super entitled, what you do is you try to create excitement. You try to create conflict. You try to get two bugs or two animals together to fight each other. And you find it entertaining because you feel privileged over that person. Well, January 6th, people wanted to feel privileged. They wanted to feel entitled. They wanted to feel like they had a free pass. And at the same time, they wanted to believe what was obviously a falsehood. I mean, if any of them had done any of their research, they wouldn't have come. They wouldn't have raided the Capitol. But then again, the complacency of the Capitol and the fact that people were able to go that far. I mean, if we were ever actually attacked by a foreign power at the Capitol, it would have been over. We would have lost all of Congress and the Senate in short order. Yet here we have these people who are unorganized. I mean, some of them are semi-organized. And these people are just angry. My generation is angry. We don't know how to communicate. We don't know how to connect with one another, not effectively. Our morals have been diminished. A lot of us weren't raised by parents. We were raised by the TV. And this new generation's being raised by YouTube. And everything that the older generation, including my grams, told me was, it's come true. Our moral fabric has deteriorated, and ultimately it's leaving our country vulnerable. January 6th should not have happened. It shouldn't have. But that's where mob mentality comes in. And mob mentality under a dictator is why we lost police officers. By people who say we support blue and then struck down actual officers with an American flag. Let that sink in. We got permission to act out our bad impulses because a lot of people are insecure in their life. They don't know where their life is going to go. A lot of us don't have direction. We just think we have to work a 9 to 5. That's what a lot of people are taught. And when those people are taught that, it creates a devaluation of oneself, which allows somebody to become a little bit more reckless, to seek out camaraderie, companionship, right? Because we are societal creatures. That's what helped human beings survive and become the dominant species on the planet. But when you've got a glass ceiling that's kind of imposed, it's very much like a dictatorship, meaning there is a glass ceiling, unless you are really, really creative or have the right connections and ends. And that's not too terribly far from where America is right now. You want to get something done, you have to have a connection or an in. Heck, I'm living proof of that. And without that in, or without that connection, and without the education to build up, and without the free time, because you're working, to build up, and to build your own dream, you can feel disenfranchised. And that's kind of what a lot of these people that I saw on January 6th look like. They look like lesser educated people. I mean, let's just be real. I listen to them talk, and so can you. I mean, I forget which network. I think it was MSNBC or something like that that did a full hour episode on January 6th after months and months and months of research. And you know what's funny? I admire the research they did because a lot of us, we presume. We presume that Dr. Fauci is going to give us something that's or recommend something that's going to kill us. That's what I've heard a lot. And I've read a lot online. The moral fabric of America has deteriorated. You know what's funny is if we just listen to the Ten Commandments, and I'm not trying to preach or nothing like that. What I'm saying is the fundamentals from the Ten Commandments are repeated through every culture and every religion since the beginning of time. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, be nice. Basically, don't be a jerk. But there was a time when saying the word jerk in that context wouldn't have even been allowed on radio, and yet it is, along with so many other words. In fact, the word jerk is just commonplace now. There are 5-year-olds that know that word fluidly, among many, many other words. Many. And there's a disregard, like people don't hold doors open for anybody else anymore. I mean, those that do are a little bit older and still have some chivalry to them. But for the most part, we don't even regard that. And parents aren't teaching that because it's kids raising kids. My generation raising the next. And that creates a moral erosion because when you don't pass on those fundamentals, then the next generation isn't able to learn from the mistakes of the past and the advantages of the past, what worked and what didn't. And here we are arguing critical race theory. CRT. Actually giving it a label just like the Nazis did. Just so that we can diminish this thing that is inconvenient. Because it makes people feel bad about their relationship to ancestors that they've never met, doing things that they never knew. And CRT also calls for accountability now. But somebody who's privileged doesn't want to be held accountable. The people on January 6th, they didn't want to be held accountable. That one druid dude, the warlock or whatever he was, with the headgear and the paint and all that stuff, is in jail asking for organic food because that suits his religion. Seriously. We are that privileged. Where you can be in jail, you can demand organic food because of your religious rights on a religion that he probably doesn't practice. True story. And people don't want to wear masks because, follow me on something, right? They didn't want to wear masks for so much. Like, this is inconvenient. I've got a breathing problem. Blah, 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 blah. Things that they never had before, they suddenly have, right? Why? Because they feel privileged, and their privilege, their, I guess you could say, comfort shopping in a store is more valuable to them than your mother or your sister or your father or your grandfather or your child. Think about that when you think about if I'm right on the moral erosion of America. We put convenience of not wearing a mask over the value of somebody else's life, and then we sought out things that made us feel good about it. Such as, well, the masks don't really work and so on and so forth. Believe it or not, they did. They minimized air spread. They minimized it. But then again, people were questioning Dr. Fauci and other medical experts that spent their entire lives dedicated to this task of basically preventing diseases. That's what happens when you, lower the education of a country, which our education has been significantly lowered just during my lifetime. But that's also what happens when you don't check the moral fabric of your country. We aren't teaching good morals anymore. We're teaching kids, hey, here's where the PlayStation is. Here's where the Xbox is. Here's your PC. Enjoy. And we wonder what the next generation's going to look like. And we fear it the same way the previous generation feared our generation. My generation. I say all that to say, we know how to live as good people. We know that we should be accepting of others, assuming any of us practices any religion that any of us could possibly believe, including atheism. Atheism basically boils down to, hey, be nice to other people, okay? I mean, YOLO, but at the same time, we're a society, like, real deal. Okay, every religion and every culture, every bit of moral fabric from everything in all of history says, be nice to one another, don't be polarized, be united. A cord of many strands is not easily broken. And that's accurate. And I'm kind of morose about the fact that we are so divided and we're remaining so. And some of us are even celebrating it. So I part saying, please get your vaccine and y'all be safe out there. I'll catch you next week. That was an episode. All right.